It is the fall of 1967, somewhere near Chattanooga, Tennessee, and a man is crawling on his hands and knees into the absolute dark of a cave called Nickajack. He cannot see his own hands in front of his face. The air smells of wet limestone and old water. Somewhere behind him, far above, is a world full of sold-out arenas, gold records, a famous black silhouette on 1,000 stages. But here, in this throat of rock beneath the earth, none of that matters. He is not Johnny Cash here. He is just a man whose body has been ravaged by amphetamines for a decade, whose first marriage has collapsed under the weight of his addiction, whose voice has been reduced some nights to a humiliated croak, and who has decided, with whatever clarity a person can have at 155 pounds of bone and nerve and chemical desperation, that he no longer wants to be found. He crawls until his flashlight dies in his hand, and then he simply lies down in the blackness and waits to disappear. What happened in the next few hours will become one of the most retold, most mythologized, most disputed moments in American music history. Some say it was a literal brush with death. Some say the story changed every time he told it. But what is not disputed is this. The man who crawled out of that cave was not the same man who crawled in, and the path that led him into that darkness, the path that led him back out of it, and the long, glittering, devastating road that followed afterward, all the way to a hospital bed in Nashville 36 years later, is the story of one of the most haunted and magnificent careers in the history of American song. Before we go further, if stories like this pull you in the way they pull me in, hit that like button right now. It tells me you want the real story, not the sanitized version. And trust me, with Johnny Cash, the real story is so much darker and so much more human than the legend. Because to understand how a sharecropper's son from the Arkansas Delta became the Man in Black, and how that same man ended up burying himself in undertones of grief that never fully left him, you have to go back. Long before Sun Records, long before Folsom Prison, long before June Carter ever sang a single note next to him. You have to go back to a cotton field in northeastern Arkansas, where two brothers worked side by side, and where one of them would die in a way that haunted the survivor for the rest of his natural life. John R. Cash was born on February 26, 1932, in the tiny town of Kingsland, Arkansas, to Ray and Carrie Cash, two struggling cotton farmers trying to survive the worst years of the Great Depression. His parents could not agree on a name. His mother wanted John. His father wanted Ray. They settled, with the exhausted compromise of two people who had bigger problems than naming a baby, on the initials J.R. He would carry that placeholder of a name for the first 18 years of his life. In March of 1935, when J.R. was only 3 years old, the Cash family packed everything they owned and moved to a place called Dyess, Arkansas, a New Deal colony built under President Franklin Roosevelt's administration to give desperate farming families a chance to work land they might someday own. There was no electricity. There was no running water for years. There was only cotton, rows and rows of it, and a 5-room house, and 7 children who learned to work the fields before they learned much else. J.R. started working in those fields at the age of 5. Picture it, a small boy with bare feet in dark soil, the sun pressing down on his shoulders, the only music in his world coming from his mother's hymns and the work songs that drifted across the fields from neighboring families, also bent low, also exhausted, also praying for rain or for the lack of it depending on the season. This was the soil, quite literally, out of which the deepest themes of Johnny Cash's music would grow. The sorrow, the hardship, the voice for the forgotten and the suppressed. It started here in Dyess, in the dirt, and it was here, in the same small town, that the first true tragedy of his life occurred. The one that would never fully leave him no matter how famous he became, no matter how many records he sold, no matter how many times the world tried to convince him that he had outrun his past. His older brother Jack was 14 years old. J.R. was 12. The two boys were nothing alike on the surface, but were inseparable beneath it. Jack was serious, mature beyond his years, the kind of teenager who seemed to already understand things that most adults never grasp. He was, by every account that survives him, the person Johnny loved more than almost anyone else on earth. His hero, his protector, his best friend. In his own words, decades later, he would write that Jack gave him something close to unconditional love, that there was a gravity to Jack, a seriousness, a moral weight that made him seem like a grown man even as a boy. In May of 1944, Jack went to work at the sawmill to earn a few extra dollars for the family, cutting fence posts on a whirling head saw. Something went wrong. The machine pulled him in. He was cut open across the abdomen in an injury so severe that there was almost no chance from the very beginning that he would survive it. He suffered for 8 days. Picture that. 8 days. 8 days of family praying over a dying child, of a community holding its breath, of a 12-year-old boy watching his hero, his protector, slowly leave the world in agonizing increments. On May 20th, 1944, Jack Cash died. Something inside JR changed in the house of grief, and it never fully changed back. According to his sister Joanne, on the day of the funeral, the boy showed up early on his own and picked up a shovel. He helped dig his own brother's grave. He stood at the service later covered in dirt, without shoes, because he stepped on a nail and his foot had swollen too badly to fit into them. He was 12 years old, and he was already learning the lesson that would define so much of his art for the rest of his life, that love and loss live in the same room, and sometimes you have to bury the people you love with your own 2 hands. There is something else buried in this story, too, something darker that rarely makes it into the polished documentaries. Johnny Cash later said he believed there had been foul play involved, that a man who had been working alongside Jack that day disappeared and was never heard from again. It was never proven. It exists only as a whisper, a rumor passed down through family memory. One more shadow in a story already full of them. If you're still with me, please subscribe to the channel right now, because what you've heard so far is only the beginning of the storm that was Johnny Cash's life. And I promise you, it gets heavier before it gets better. There was another shadow in that house, too, one that lived not in a memory of tragedy, but in the daily texture of Cash's childhood. His father, Ray. In his early writing, when Ray was still alive, Johnny described him with the careful, reverent sons often give of fathers they are still trying to win over. But by 1997, after Ray had passed, the truth came out in a different shape. Johnny Cash described his father as an alcoholic, as abusive, as, in Johnny's own painful phrase, an evil man. There were even worse stories, according to those close to him, that never made it into the final draft of his autobiography because they were too dark to print. And there was something quietly devastating layered underneath all of it. By several accounts, Ray Cash had favored Jack, the golden son, the serious, mature one, the one who died at 14, which meant that JR, the boy who survived, grew up not only grieving his brother, but also living in the lingering shadow of a father's preference for a dead child over a living one. Tell me in the comments if you ever felt like you were competing with a ghost, because that, in many ways, is exactly what young Johnny Cash spent his whole childhood doing. He found his escape the way so many poor Southern children of his era did. Through the radio, through gospel music, through his mother teaching him chords on a guitar she'd scraped together money to buy. He sang publicly for the first time at church. He sang on a local radio station while still in high school. Music wasn't a luxury for this family. It was survival, the same way the cotton was survival, the same way faith was survival. After graduating high school in 1950, he tried his luck at a factory job in Michigan, hated it, and instead enlisted in the United States Air Force. He was sent to Landsberg, Germany, where he worked as a radio intercept operator, secretly listening in on Soviet transmissions during the tense early years of the Cold War. It was there, with $5 and a desire that wouldn't quiet itself, that he bought his very first guitar and formed his first band, the Landsberg Barbarians. It was also there that he first heard a film that would change the trajectory of his entire career, a low-budget movie called Inside the Walls of Folsom Prison. He never forgot it. Before his deployment, during basic training in San Antonio, Texas, a 17-year-old girl named Vivian Liberto caught his eye at a roller skating rink. They dated for 3 weeks before he shipped overseas. For the next 3 years, separated by an ocean, they exchanged hundreds of love letters, the kind of devoted, handwritten correspondence that feels almost impossible to imagine in any era after this one. 1 month after his discharge in 1954, they were married. It should have been the beginning of a simple, happy story. A returning serviceman, a devoted young wife. For daughters who would come along in the following years, Roseanne, Kathy, Cindy, and Tara. But the success that was about to find Johnny Cash would also be the very thing that tore that family apart, piece by piece, mile by exhausting mile. In Memphis, Cash took a job as an appliance salesman while chasing his real dream on the side. He met two other musicians, Marshall Grant and Luther Perkins, and the three of them auditioned for a small label run by a man named Sam Phillips. Sun Records, the same label that had just discovered a young man named Elvis Presley. Cash wanted to record gospel. Phillips told him there was no market for it and sent him home to write something original. Cash came back with Hey Porter and Cry, Cry, Cry. They were hits. And just like that, the slow-talking sharecropper's son from Dyess, Arkansas, was on his way to becoming a star. But stardom in the music industry of the 1950s meant something brutal: endless touring. Cash would eventually be away from home as much as 80% of the year, logging hundreds of thousands of miles on the road, playing one-night gigs in towns most people couldn't find on a map. And somewhere on those endless highways, on a long drive to Jacksonville, Florida, in 1957, someone offered him a pill to help him stay awake. It was an amphetamine, a Benny, as they called them then. Cheap, easy to get, and devastatingly effective at keeping an exhausted touring musician on his feet for one more show, one more interview, one more night away from the wife and children waiting at home. It was the beginning of an addiction that would, by his own later admission, plague him for most of the rest of his life. The pills did what pills like that always do. They worked, and then they demanded more of themselves to keep working. Cash needed barbiturates to come down from the amphetamines, and then more amphetamines to get back up again, a chemical pendulum swinging back and forth across the line of sanity. His weight dropped to a skeletal 155 pounds on a 6'1" frame. His voice, one commanding bass baritone, sometimes reduced itself to a hoarse, broken croak on stage. His behavior grew erratic, paranoid, frightening to the people who loved him. In 1965, narcotics officers arrested him in El Paso, Texas, after finding nearly 700 amphetamine capsules and almost 500 tranquilizer tablets hidden inside his guitar case. The arrest made national news. That same year, in a fit of drug-fueled rage, he smashed 51 footlights at the Grand Ole Opry with his microphone stand and was banned from the stage. He wrecked his Cadillac in a crash that broke his nose and his jaw. And at home in California, his marriage to Vivian was dissolving in real time. Drug abuse, constant absence, affairs with other women on the road, and, perhaps most painfully for Vivian, his deepening emotional closeness with another singer who toured alongside him, June Carter, of the legendary Carter family. There was something else happening to that marriage, too, something uglier than addiction, something that belonged to the darkest corners of American prejudice in the 1960s. Vivian Liberto had a dark complexion. White supremacist groups and certain media outlets accused the couple of an illegal interracial marriage and began calling Vivian black in print, an accusation meant to humiliate and endanger them both. Rather than simply ignoring the attacks, Cash made the bizarre decision to publicly list the segregated whites-only institutions Vivian had attended and explain her Italian heritage in detail. A response that, according to those who lived through it with her, only inflamed the situation further and added enormous stress to an already crumbling marriage. The couple eventually sued for libel, but the damage to their relationship, layered on top of the addiction and the absences in the affairs, was already irreversible. Vivian filed for divorce in 1966. Stop for a second and think about what we've covered so far. A brother dead at 14. A father who couldn't hide his preference for a dead son over a living one. A marriage destroyed by addiction and public racial cruelty. And Johnny Cash was still only in his 30s. If this story is hitting you as hard as it hit me while researching it, drop a comment below and tell me which part of his life surprised you the most. I read every single one, and I want to know, by 1967, Cash's addiction had reached what almost everyone around him believed was its terminal stage. He was living separately from his soon-to-be ex-wife, sharing quarters at times with fellow addict and outlaw country legend Waylon Jennings, the two of them hiding stashes of pills from each other in an atmosphere thick with paranoia and delusion. June Carter and her parents, Maybelle and Ezra Carter, the very bedrock of American country music's most legendary family, moved into Cash's home to try to save his life. June flushed his pills down toilets. when he screamed at her in withdrawal-fueled rage. She calmly read Bible verses aloud until he calmed down. And still, even with all of that, Cash reached a point where he decided he simply did not want to keep living. That is what brought him, in the fall of 1967, into Nickajack Cave outside Chattanooga, Tennessee, alone high, carrying extra pills, and intending to crawl so deep into darkness that he would never find his way back out. A cave, history tells us, that already held the remains of lost explorers and deserting Confederate soldiers from a century earlier. A cave that seemed, in every sense, like a fitting place for a desperate man to disappear. He crawled until his flashlight died. He laid down in absolute blackness, ready, by his own account, to let it end there. And then, he said, something happened. He felt, in his words, farther from God than he had ever felt in his life. And in that exact moment of total spiritual and physical emptiness, something shifted. A feeling came over him that it was not, in fact, his time to die. He found a faint draft of air moving through the dark and followed it, crawling on his hands and knees back toward the entrance of the cave, back toward the world, back toward life. When he emerged, June Carter and her mother Maybelle were waiting for him outside. Biographers have since questioned some of the details of this story. Marshall Grant, his longtime bass player who lived through those years beside him, has flatly said it never happened the way Cash described it. Researchers have pointed out that the cave itself was partially underwater by the time Cash claimed the event took place, after a dam had altered the water levels years earlier. Whether the cave story is a precise account of one single night, or whether it is, as some biographers suggest, a kind of theological shorthand Cash built over decades of retelling to explain his own complicated, uneven, lifelong battle with addiction, the deeper truth underneath it remains undisputed. 1967 was the year Johnny Cash nearly died, in one form or another in the year he began, however imperfectly, to fight his way back. On February 22, 1968, in front of 5,000 people at a concert in London, Ontario, Johnny Cash got down on one knee on stage and asked June Carter to marry him. She said yes. They married just over a week later, on March 1st, 1968, in Franklin, Kentucky. It would become, in the popular imagination, one of the great love stories of American music, The Woman Who Saved the Broken Man. The Hollywood version of this story, the one immortalized decades later in the film Walk the Line, paints it as redemption arriving cleanly, almost like a fairy tale. But the truth, as June and Johnny's own son, John Carter Cash, has said publicly, is more complicated than that. There is an image, he once explained, of a woman saving a man in 1968, and everything afterward being a bed of roses. That simply was not true. There were struggles throughout the 1980s and the 1990s every bit as severe as the struggles of the 1960s. Different drugs, different decades, the same addiction returning again and again, because, in his son's own words, the very nature of addiction is that the addict is incorrigible. Cash's daughter Roseanne, his child from his first marriage to Vivian, put even more starkly years later. The neat story of a woman rescuing a man and everything being fine afterward, she said, is nice and clean, and people can understand it easily. The truth is that her father struggled with addiction for the rest of his life. He did get clean for a period after birth of his and June's son, John Carter Cash, on March 3rd, 1970. He quit smoking. He went to church regularly. For 7 years, by most accounts, he stayed off amphetamines entirely. It was, by any measure, a genuine triumph, hard-won and real. But the drugs came back. They always came back. And as Marshall Grant, the man who had stood beside him since the earliest days at Sun Records, said with weary, brutal honesty decades later, by the time they came back for good, the end result was, in his words, laying out in the cemetery in Hendersonville, Tennessee. He had, by then, destroyed every vital organ in his body. A long, hard, sad story, Grant called it. Those words, coming from a man who had loved Cash like a brother for 40 years, land with the weight of eulogy spoken long before the funeral. Take a moment, if you need it. This story doesn't get lighter from here, but it does get more human, more redemptive in its own complicated way, and more worth telling all the way to the end. If you want to see how this story finishes, make sure you're subscribed, because the final chapter of Johnny Cash's life is, in some ways, the most beautiful and the most devastating part of all. The decades that followed brought extraordinary highs. The legendary live albums recorded at Folsom State Prison and San Quentin, where Cash performed for men society had already discarded, men he refused to look down on because he understood in his bones what it meant to be broken and judged for it. A network television variety show. A supergroup called the Highwaymen, alongside Willie Nelson, Waylon Jennings, and Chris Christopherson. 11 Grammy Awards across his lifetime. Membership in both the Country Music Hall of Fame and the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, an honor almost no other artist of his generation could claim in both categories simultaneously. But the body, weakened by decades of amphetamines, alcohol, and physical strain, was already beginning its long, slow betrayal. In 1988, at the age of 56, Cash underwent double bypass heart surgery. In 1997, after years of unsteadiness on stage that frightened even his closest family members, doctors diagnosed him with Parkinson's disease. A week later, that diagnosis changed to a rare and devastating neurodegenerative disorder called Shy-Drager syndrome, also known as multiple system atrophy, a condition that attacks the body's ability to control its own most basic functions. He was told he had perhaps 18 months left to live. The diagnosis would shift again, this time to autonomic neuropathy, nerve damage tied directly to a disease that had quietly been undermining his body for years: diabetes. The same year, 1997, a severe case of pneumonia left him in a coma for nearly 2 weeks. The man whose voice had once commanded sold-out arenas was now confined, in his final years, to a wheelchair, his legs so damaged by nerve deterioration that he needed leg braces and specially fitted shoes just to attempt to stand. And yet, astonishingly defiantly, he kept making music, working with producer Rick Rubin in the final chapter of his career. Cash recorded a series of albums under the American Recordings banner that many critics consider among the most powerful work of his entire life. Stripped down, raw, just his voice and guitar, recorded the way he'd first dreamed of making music as a boy in Dyess, Arkansas. In 2002, on the album American 4, The Man Comes Around, he recorded a cover of the Nine Inch Nails song Hurt. Trent Reznor, the song's original writer, admitted he was skeptical when he first heard that Johnny Cash wanted to cover it. He was not skeptical for long. The accompanying video, filmed when Cash was visibly frail, visibly dying, became one of the most devastating pieces of music video ever produced, an old man looking directly into the lens of his own mortality and singing about it without flinching. It won a Grammy. Many critics still call it one of the greatest music videos ever made. Through all of this physical collapse, one constant remained at his side: June. For 35 years, through relapses and recoveries, through fame and physical ruin, she stayed. She had spent decades pulling pills out of his pockets and flushing them down hotel toilets. She had read him scripture through his screaming withdrawals. She had stood outside a cave in the Tennessee dark, waiting for a man she loved to either come back to her or not. On May 15th, 2003, June Carter Cash died at the age of 73 from complications following heart surgery. Those close to the couple feared, almost immediately, that Johnny would not survive long without her. Rick Rubin, his producer and one of his closest confidants in those final years, spoke with him by phone shortly after June's death. Cash told him he had been in tremendous pain his entire life, but had never felt anything like this. He sounded inconsolable. He sounded, in Rubin's own words, the weakest and the oldest he had ever heard him. Rubin, almost without knowing why, found himself asking Cash if he thought he could find the faith to get through this. The question struck something deep in him. Cash kept working anyway. He had promised June he would. He continued recording. His last public performance came in July of 2003, just 2 months before his own death, a frail, determined man standing in front of an audience one final time, fulfilling a promise to a woman who was no longer there to hear it. On the morning of September 12, 2003, less than 4 months after losing June, Johnny Cash died at Baptist Hospital in Nashville, Tennessee. He was 71 years old. His manager, Lou Robin, released a statement explaining that Cash had died from complications of diabetes, which had ultimately resulted in respiratory failure. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, surrounded by people who loved him, The man in black took his final breath. He was buried beside June at Hendersonville Memory Gardens, near the home they had shared for so many years. According to biographer Robert Hilburn, in his last moments of lucidity at the very end of his life, Emilio Azcárraga is not the only legendary man to speak the name of someone already gone. Cash, too, in his own final hours, was a man reaching backward across decades of sorrow and survival toward the people and the moments that had shaped him most. There is a particular kind of tragedy in a life like this one, and it is not the tragedy of failure. Johnny Cash did not fail. He sold more than 90 million records. He left behind over 1,000 songs. He gave a voice deliberately and consistently throughout his career to people that polite society preferred to ignore. Prisoners, the poor Native Americans who suffer in the country want to forget, addicts nobody else wanted to look in the eye. He did all of that while carrying, inside himself, the 12-year-old boy who dug his brother's grave with his own hands. The young husband who lost his first marriage to addiction he could not control. The desperate man who once crawled into utter darkness because he could no longer see a reason to stay in the light. The tragedy of Johnny Cash is not that he died. Everyone dies. The tragedy is how long he spent fighting a war inside his own body and mind that never fully ended, not even in his moments of greatest triumph, not even with June beside him for 35 years, not even with millions of fans who loved him completely. He once described himself as the biggest sinner of them all, a man who contained multitudes, contradictions piled on top of contradictions, devout and self-destructive, gentle and volcanic, a believer who nearly killed himself in a cave and then spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of why he hadn't. Maybe that is the real lesson hiding underneath the myth of the man in black, not that love conquers addiction in some clean, permanent, movie-ready way. His own family has told us plainly that it didn't, not completely, but that a person can be broken again and again by grief, by chemistry, by his own choices, and still manage, somehow, across 7 decades, to leave behind something true, something that still reaches people who were not even born when he sang it, something that still makes you stop, decades later, and listen to a dying man's voice cracking to the words of a song that was never originally his, and feel, in that crack, every single thing he ever survived. Johnny Cash spent his whole life walking the line between darkness and light, and in the end, perhaps that line was never as clean as the songs made it sound. What do you think haunted him more in the end? The brother he lost as a boy, or the man he kept losing and finding inside of himself for the rest of his life? If this story moved you, give it a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the lives behind the legends. And let me know in the comments which Johnny Cash song hits you the hardest now that you know the whole story behind the man who wrote it.